All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You ready to, dive into something pretty heady today?
Always up for a challenge. What we got?
This one's called Natural Language Ontology. And I know right off the bat it sounds a bit intimidating, but really think about it like this. We're going to explore how the very language we use shapes our understanding of what exists, like the basic building blocks of reality.
So it's not about some kind of philosophy jargon being imposed on language.
Exactly. It's more about those underlying assumptions we make every time we open our mouths to speak. Like, think about how we talk about shadows. We say, look at that shadow, as if it's a thing, you know?
Hmm.
But is it really? Like, what is a shadow?
I see. So we're getting into some pretty deep philosophical waters here, exploring those taken for granted ideas hidden within the way we speak.
Yeah, and luckily we've got a great guide for this deep dive. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, you guessed it, natural language ontology.
Oh, the Stanford Encyclopedia. Solid choice. I mean, it's a relatively new field, this whole natural language ontology thing. Sort of this fascinating crossroads where philosophy meets linguistics.
Right. And thinkers have been kind of poking around these ideas for centuries, but it's only recently that it's become its own distinct area. And a lot of that's thanks to all the work in how we analyze the meaning of language.
Makes sense. We're always refining our tools for understanding language.
So our mission today is to unpack these often invisible assumptions in language. It's like giving you a shortcut to understanding a fundamental part of how we as humans perceive and categorize the world. And trust me, we'll skip the dense academic stuff. We're all about making this accessible and even, dare I say, fun.
Fun philosophy. I like it.
And get this, we'll uncover some aha moments along the way. We'll see how the words we use every single day reveal some surprising stuff about how we think the world works. So, first things first, what exactly is natural language ontology?
Well, in a nutshell, it's the study of the built-in system of categories, structures, and, well, ideas about existence that are kind of woven into our natural language. But, and this is key, it's super important to distinguish this from something called foundational metaphysics.
Right, foundational metaphysics. That sounds heavy.
It is. It deals with what ultimately exists, like at the deepest, most fundamental level of reality. Natural language ontology, on the other hand, is more aligned with, well, philosopher Peter Strawson called it descriptive metaphysics.
Descriptive metaphysics. So it's more about how we typically conceptualize the world using our language rather than the ultimate truth of what's really out there.
Precisely. And it's also similar to what philosopher Kit Fine calls naive metaphysics, which focuses on the metaphysics of how things appear to us, our ordinary experience of the world filtered through the lens of language.
Gotcha. So it's less about what truly is in some absolute sense and more about what we, as speakers of a language, automatically treat as existing based on how we talk.
Exactly. It's about uncovering the ontology that's implicit in being a competent user of a language.
Mm.
And as we said, this field has really blossomed with all the advances in natural language semantics.
Right, all the research into how meaning works in language. But you mentioned earlier that philosophers have been engaging with this kind of analysis for ages, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
They might not have used the fancy label natural language ontology, but whenever they've used examples from language or built arguments around how we describe things, they've been tapping into this implicit ontology.
It's like language is a window into our underlying assumptions about the world, and philosophers have always peeked through that window. Now, before we go any further, could you remind us of what natural language ontology isn't? Just to make those boundaries clear.
Sure. So firstly, the ontology of natural language isn't about what individual speakers consciously believe. I mean, someone might blurt out, hey, look, a ghost.
Yeah.
But when you press them, they may not actually believe in ghosts.
Right, like it's a figure of speech or something, not a genuine ontological commitment.
Exactly. Natural language ontology aims for something deeper, something embedded in the language itself, regardless of individual quirks or beliefs. And secondly, it's not the same as the ontology of cognition.
Okay, so separate from how our brains process information in general.
Yeah. While language and thought are deeply connected, they don't necessarily categorize the world in the exact same way. And lastly, it's not about the ontology of linguistic things themselves, like words, meanings, sounds. That's a different ballgame.
Right, so we're not talking about the building blocks of language itself. Got it. Now let's dive into how language can be used to clarify those intuitions that philosophers are always talking about. Can you unpack that a bit?
So philosophers often work with these things called intuitions. They're kind of like those immediate intellectual seemings or gut feelings about things, not really arrived at through logic or reasoning. They just sort of
Yeah,
pop
that
out,
aha no as we talked about.
like those aha moments we talked about. Exactly. And these intuitions are often treated as like primary data for philosophers.
Mm.
Now, natural language, with its inherent structure and the distinctions it makes, gives us a way to really examine and clarify these intuitions, especially when they're about fundamental questions of existence.
So language helps us articulate those gut feelings about the world, especially those what is this thing kinds of feelings.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of how language helps to clarify these ontological distinctions, the ones we sort of grasp intuitively?
Oh, sure. A classic example, and one that Kit Fine talks about a lot, is the difference between, say, a statue and the bronze it's made from.
Yeah.
Think about the kinds of things we can say about each.
Hmm. Yeah, like the statue is damaged, or the statue is beautiful, or even the statue is old.
Precisely. But it sounds weird to say those same things about the bronze itself,
Hmm.
right? You might say the bronze was melted down, but can it be beautiful in the same way the statue is?
I guess not. It's the form of the statue that we find beautiful, not just the lump of bronze.
Right. Our language, through those different types of descriptions, reveals that we intuitively grasp a difference between the statue as an object and the bronze as just, well, matter. It suggests we don't see them as the same kind of entity.
That's such a cool example of how language points to those subtle yet important distinctions in how we understand things. What about another example?
Well, another biggie is the difference between objects and events. While some philosophical theories might try to reduce one to the other, our language treats them pretty distinctly. For example, take how we talk about their existence.
We say a house exists, but a party happens or takes place. I've never thought about that before.
Right. You wouldn't say the house happened or the party existed. Sounds totally off. And the way we relate them to space is different too. The protest took place in the square. Makes sense, but the monument existed in the square sounds kind of redundant. We just say the monument was in the square. Right?
Yeah, you're right. It's so interesting how we intuitively use different language for those categories without even realizing it.
And these linguistic patterns point to the idea that we, at a deep level, categorize objects and events as fundamentally different kinds of entities.
Okay, so language helps us get at these core intuitions about existence. But doesn't this method rely on a few assumptions? Like, we're assuming these intuitions are kind of universal.
You got it.
Yeah.
Philosophers who use natural language in this way generally assume that our fundamental intuitions are pretty consistent across people, and that the way we express them through language is also, to a certain extent, similar across different languages. If our intuitions and their linguistic expression were completely different from person to person or language to language, well, language wouldn't be a very reliable tool for philosophy, would it?
It'd be like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that this approach isn't exactly new. It goes way back in philosophy, all the way to Aristotle and medieval thinkers. It's also played a big role in more recent movements like phenomenology and early analytic philosophy.
So it's got a long and rich history. All right, moving on. How does this specific ontology reflected in language connect to, the actual world out there?
Now we're getting into some really meaty territory. One way language seems to reflect ontology is through the kinds of noun phrases we use to refer to things. For example, when we talk about whiteness, like the whiteness of the snow, that might suggest we've got an ontological category of qualities or properties.
And whiteness is an example of what linguists call a bare adjective nominalization. It's like we're turning the adjective white into a noun, which suggests we think of it as a kind of thing.
Exactly. And when we talk about running, like the running of the bulls, that points to the category of events. It's a deverbal nominalization, turning the verb run into a noun. And traditionally, philosophers have used these linguistic forms as evidence for the real existence of things like properties and events.
It's like our language is giving us a map of what it thinks the fundamental building blocks of reality are.
Precisely. But here's the thing. The traditional view that language perfectly mirrors reality has faced some serious challenges.
Why is that? What's changed?
Well, the old idea was that language is just a straightforward reflection of the way the world is, kind of like a mirror held up to reality. But nowadays, there's this growing idea that the ontology embedded in natural language might actually differ from the ontology of what's truly real or fundamental.
So the map might not perfectly match the territory.
Exactly. And a lot of the things we routinely talk about might not actually be considered fundamental entities by philosophers.
So can you give us some examples of these potentially non-fundamental entities that our language allows us to talk about?
Of course, think about things like holes, shadows, smiles, arguments, debts. We refer to all these things with noun phrases. But would most philosophers consider them to be the basic stuff of reality, like atoms or quarks or energy fields?
Probably not. They seem more like products of other things or concepts or maybe even just ways of talking.
You got it. And we also have what are called construction-dependent objects, things like the students in the classroom, which is a plurality, or the increasing anxiety, which is a kind of functional object,
Mm.
or even intentional objects like the unicorn Sarah imagined.
Which might not exist in the physical world at all.
Precisely. So we talk about them as if they're out there, but their ontological status is, well, it's fuzzy. And
Yeah.
it raises an interesting question of whether our language might be tricking us into believing in things that aren't really fundamental.
It's like language has a mind of its own. It's making us think these things are more real than they might actually be.
In a way, yes. And then you've got inconsistencies within language itself. Like the verb exist doesn't always carry the same meaning as the philosophical noun existence.
Mhm.
And the mass count distinction, the difference between water and a glass of water or furniture and a piece of furniture,
Mhm.
it's super important grammatically.
But you're saying it might not actually reflect a deep difference in the underlying reality?
Right. It could just be a quirk of how our language categorizes and individuates things. And this is where the distinction between descriptive metaphysics and foundational metaphysics becomes really, really important.
Right, because one's about the way we ordinarily talk and think about the world, and the other's about the ultimate nature of reality, whatever that might be. So how do these, inconsistencies in language support that distinction?
Well, they highlight that our everyday language, with its built-in intuitions, which is the realm of descriptive metaphysics, might be painting a picture of reality that doesn't quite align with what foundational metaphysics is trying to get at, the true nature of reality. Descriptive metaphysics wants to map out the ontology that's inherent in our language and common sense. Foundational metaphysics is all about figuring out what truly exists at the deepest level, and it might end up revising or even contradicting the picture our language gives us.
So it's like we need to understand the map before we can go out and explore the territory itself. And that's where Fine's argument comes in, right? That foundational metaphysics actually needs descriptive metaphysics as a starting point.
Exactly. You can't investigate what's fundamentally real without first grasping the basic concepts we use to think about reality. And that's precisely what descriptive metaphysics, with help from natural language ontology, gives us.
We need to understand how our language presents the world, even if it's not completely accurate, before we can try to dig deeper and figure out how things really are. It's like trying to do physics without understanding basic measurements.
A perfect analogy. And even if we're skeptical about ever fully grasping ultimate reality, studying the ontology within our language is still super valuable. It helps us understand how we make sense of the world. It's like a cognitive map, even if it's a bit distorted.
It's the map we use to navigate reality, even if it's not perfectly to scale. Okay, but this raises a really interesting puzzle. If the ontology in our language might not actually match up with reality, how can sentences about these potentially unreal things even be true or false? I mean, truth seems like a pretty fundamental aspect of language.
Absolutely. And this mismatch between the ontology of language and the ontology of reality opens up a whole bunch of possibilities. One is that, well, maybe we're just plain wrong sometimes. We might be using language that refers to things that don't really exist, like when a child says, "The tooth fairy left me money."
So some of our language might be based on error or wishful thinking.
In a way, yes. Another possibility is that some of these entities in the ontology of language have a kind of fictional status.
Hmm.
So a sentence about them might be considered true within a certain context or framework, even if it's not true in the real world. Like unicorns have horns is true within the world of mythology, even though unicorns don't exist.
Right, like how we can talk about fictional characters and events and judge their truth within the story world.
Exactly. And then there's the idea that, well, maybe these entities aren't fundamental, but they're still real in a derivative kind of way. Like a shadow exists because of an object blocking light. It's real, but it depends on something else for its existence. And finally, as we mentioned before, some folks who study natural language ontology just stay agnostic about the whole metaphysical status of these entities. They're focused on what language itself tells us, regardless of whether it matches some deeper reality.
So there are a bunch of different ways to make sense of this potential mismatch. The entry also brought up Chomsky's radical idea that maybe referential noun phrases, the ones that seem to point to specific things, don't actually refer to external objects at all. Instead, he thinks they might refer to internal cognitive representations. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Chomsky's view is definitely a game changer. If he's right, it would have huge implications for natural language ontology. He's proposed this idea called internalist semantics, where the meaning of words and phrases is grounded in the structure of our minds, not in a direct relationship to things in the external world.
So our language might be more about how our minds organize information than about creating a mirror image of reality.
Exactly. And that challenges the traditional view that the ontology of language is primarily about how it maps onto the real world. It shifts the focus to the ontological commitments of our cognitive architecture, the structure of our minds as reflected through language. So instead of trying to figure out what's out there based on language, we might be better off studying how our minds carve up the world conceptually.
Wow, that's a pretty major shift in thinking. Okay, so maybe language is more about our internal mental landscape than a direct guide to the external world. Now let's switch gears and talk about how the ontology embedded in language relates to our broader cognition and reasoning abilities. Are they the same thing?
That's a great question. While there's definitely a close connection between the two, they're not exactly the same. It's important to keep them distinct, even though both linguistics and cognitive science explore these areas.
Okay, so can you give us an example of how language and general cognition might differ in how they categorize or organize the world?
Sure, let's think about how we form groups or collections of things. In language, we use definite plural noun phrases like the books on the table or mass nouns like the water in the lake to refer to these collections. And we seem to be able to form sums without many limits. I can talk about all the grains of sand on all the beaches in the world without any grammatical problems.
Right, language doesn't seem to care how big or complex the collection is.
Exactly. But our everyday cognition about objects doesn't always work that way. If you open your junk drawer, you probably don't see all the random stuff in there as one unified thing, right?
Not really. Each thing has its own separate existence in my mind, even if they're jumbled together in the drawer.
Right. There seem to be cognitive limits, perhaps based on what we can perceive or how things function together, that influence how we group things into single entities in our minds. Language seems more flexible in that regard.
So my junk drawer isn't an ontological category in my mind, even though I can refer to all the stuff in my junk drawer linguistically.
Right.
Cool. What's another difference?
The mass count distinction is another great example. Remember how English treats sand as a mass noun, but other languages might treat its equivalent as a count noun. That probably doesn't reflect a real difference in how we perceive sand cognitively. It's more like an arbitrary grammatical choice. Our ability to distinguish individual grains of sand is probably the same, regardless of the language we speak.
So the way our language chooses to chop up and count the world might not perfectly match how our minds naturally work. Makes sense. Now, switching gears a bit, when we talk about the ontology embedded in language, are we talking about something that speakers consciously believe in? Like, do they have to explicitly endorse it?
This is a subtle point, but really important. Just because we use language that seems to presuppose certain kinds of entities, it doesn't automatically mean we consciously believe in them. For example, like to say, John stopped smoking, which implies there was a smoking event without necessarily having a strong opinion about the nature of events.
So it's more like we're implicitly accepting those categories as part of how the language works, not necessarily as part of our personal belief system.
Exactly. It's like a background assumption that comes along with speaking the language, not a philosophical stance. And this highlights the difference between intuition and reasoned belief. We can use language to make explicit ontological claims like properties are real, or there are no such things as abstract objects.
But those are more like our attempts to figure things out intellectually, rather than reflecting the basic automatic assumptions built into the language itself.
Precisely. The ontology of natural language shows up in much more subtle ways. Think about the assumptions carried by certain verbs, like blame. To say, John blamed Mary for the broken vase presupposes that there was, in fact, a broken vase.
Right, the sentence doesn't make sense without that assumption.
Or consider the grammatical rules about what kinds of noun phrases can be the subject or object of certain verbs. These restrictions offer clues about the ontological categories within the language. For example, you can see a dog being a physical object. but it's harder to make sense of seeing a redness, redness being a property.
It's like the grammar is giving us hints about the kinds of things the language knows about, the kinds of things it can handle conceptually.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. And some linguistic theories even suggest that our grasp of a language's ontology might be a kind of tacit knowledge, like how we know the rules of grammar without necessarily being able to explain them. This could explain why we keep using language in ways that assume a certain ontology, even if we try to argue against it philosophically.
It's deeper than just a set of beliefs. It's like an ingrained habit of thought. So with all this in mind, why should philosophers care about natural language ontology? How does it help them do philosophy better?
Well, for starters, as we've been talking about, it provides a really rigorous method for doing descriptive metaphysics.
Mm.
By carefully analyzing how our metaphysical intuitions show up in language, we get a clearer picture of our conceptual framework, before we start building philosophical theories.
So it gives us better tools for understanding our pre-theoretical grasp of reality before we start philosophizing about it. What else?
Another big reason is that a lot of those classic philosophical debates about things like universals, abstract objects, you name it, have always been tied up with language. Philosophers have used the way we talk about these things to support their arguments.
Right, like the debate about whether there's a single entity redness that all red things share.
Exactly. Natural language ontology, with its focus on careful linguistic analysis, can offer fresh perspectives on these old problems by putting that linguistic evidence under a microscope. We need to make sure our understanding of the language is solid before we build big philosophical theories on top of it.
It's about checking our foundations before we build this skyscraper. Makes sense. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of how natural language reflects ontology. What are the mechanisms involved?
Well, one key mechanism is through the different roles that entities play within sentences, what we call semantic roles.
Like the good old subject and object roles, or maybe agent and patient.
Right, but also some more subtle roles. One is the semantic value of referential noun phrases and variables, which basically means what those expressions stand for. Philosophers like Frege and Quine thought these were super important for understanding ontology. Frege said the meaning of a proper name is just the object it points to, and Quine famously said, to be is to be the value of a variable.
Kitschy. So if our language lets us use a word or phrase to pick out a specific thing, that suggests we think of it as an entity of some kind.
Yeah, and the ability to use those terms in quantificational statements, like all dogs or some cats, is a strong indicator of ontological commitment. But of course, there are some tricky cases.
Oh, I bet. Language is never simple. What are some of the challenges?
Well, there are noun phrases that look referential, but they don't actually seem to refer to anything in the real world. Think of Santa Claus in the sentence, Santa Claus doesn't exist, or John is thinking about Santa Claus. Some philosophers, like the Menungians, think these terms still refer to objects, just objects that don't exist in our world. Others say they're just empty names.
So the ontology gets a bit fuzzy when we talk about fictional or imaginary things.
Exactly. And then there's the issue that not all quantificational phrases work the same way ontologically. Some might seem to introduce new entities into the meaning of a sentence, while others range over more abstract things like properties or relations. The relationship between the grammar and the ontology isn't always straightforward.
Right. Language can be slippery. So what are some of the other semantic roles beyond just reference that might tell us something about ontology?
Well, another big one is the role of implicit arguments. Take Davidson's analysis of adverbs. In John Walked Slowly, he argued that there's an implicit event, John's walking, that both the verb walk and the adverb slowly are modifying.
So even though we don't see a separate word for the event itself, it's still there in the meaning of the sentence.
Exactly. And some linguists and philosophers think there are implicit tropes, particularized properties or degrees that are arguments of adjectives. So the idea is that our language might be implicitly committed to these kinds of entities, even if we don't explicitly refer to them with nouns.
Like a secret ontology hidden beneath the surface of our sentences. What about things like tense and modality, those words that deal with time and possibility? How did those relate to ontology?
Those often involve what are called parameters of evaluation and truth makers. Basically, standard semantic theories say that the truth of a sentence depends on things like the time it was uttered and the possible world being considered. Tenses and temporal adverbs shift the time we're talking about. Modal verbs like could and must shift the possible world we're considering.
Right, like it might rain tomorrow is talking about a possible future, not a guaranteed one.
Exactly. But these parameters of evaluation, while crucial for understanding meaning, don't carry the same kind of direct ontological commitment as referential terms or implicit arguments. They're more like theoretical tools in our analysis. However, if our language has expressions that do refer to these parameters, like yesterday for a time or in that scenario for a world, then the connection to ontology gets stronger.
So it hinges on whether our language allows us to actually refer to those parameters as things.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears again, what about the principle of compositionality? The idea that the meaning of a whole sentence is built up from the meanings of its parts. How does that connect to ontology?
Compositionality is super important here. The ontology that emerges from our analysis of language totally depends on how we think the meanings of complex expressions are created. Different theories about meaning will lead to different conclusions about ontology. For example, Frege believed that predicates, like is read, refer to concepts, which he thought were a special kind of entity that needs to be filled in by an object.
Yeah.
So how you think language works at the basic level really shapes your view of what exists.
It's all connected. Okay, what about grammatical categories like nouns, verbs, adjectives? Do those map onto ontological categories in a straightforward way?
It's tempting to think so. Verbs often relate to events or processes, adjectives to properties or qualities. But it's not always that simple. We can often express the same idea using different parts of speech. And some modern syntactic theories, like distributive morphology and radical lexical decomposition, challenge this simple mapping. They suggest that the underlying structure of language is much more complex than those surface categories might suggest. Even the position of a phrase within a sentence can carry ontological information, according to theories like cartographic syntax.
So we can't just look at a word's part of speech and assume we know its ontological counterpart. What about words and constructions that seem inherently linked to metaphysical concepts, like the verb to be, modal verbs like must and can, and expressions of existence, dependence, part-whole relations, causation, and truth? Those seem pretty loaded philosophically.
They are. The copula to be can express identity, predication, and existence. Modal verbs deal with possibility and necessity, which are big metaphysical topics. And existence predicates seem directly concerned with what exists. But here's the crucial question. Are these expressions being used in their ordinary, everyday sense, what we've been calling the core of language? Or, in a more technical, philosophical way, the periphery?
Right, that core-periphery distinction is key for figuring out what natural language ontology is really trying to get at. So how do we tell the difference? What makes something part of the core versus the periphery?
That's the tricky part, and there's no easy answer. One way to think about it is in terms of how deeply ingrained those concepts are in our minds and how easily we learn them. Core concepts are probably grasped very early on, just through exposure to language. Periphery concepts might need more conscious reflection or specialized learning. Another way to think about it is in terms of the grammar itself. Maybe core concepts are more closely tied to basic grammatical structures and the meanings of common words, while periphery concepts are more about specialized vocabulary and constructions. But it's not always a clean distinction. Like the verb exist seems pretty core, but the noun existence seems more peripheral because it's often used for more abstract philosophical ideas.
So it's not just about whether a word sounds philosophical, but more about how central it is to the everyday workings of the language. Okay, before we move on to the final big topic, I want to circle back to a point you made earlier about complex MPs and constructional ontology. Refresh my memory. What's that all about?
So, that idea suggests that the way we build complex noun phrases might point to a kind of ontological pluralism, meaning there might not be just one single ontology underlying language, but maybe different ontological frameworks associated with different linguistic constructions or cognitive functions. It's like language is a toolbox with different compartments for different kinds of entities.
Okay, and one of those compartments is how we refer to unrestricted sums and kinds, right?
Right. Remember how we talked about definite plural noun phrases like the chairs in this room and mass nouns like the water in the glass? They let us form these collections or sums without many restrictions. Grammatically, I can talk about the collection of all the grains of sand on all the beaches on Earth without any issues. This might suggest a kind of mereological universalism in language, where any collection can be a whole. But this clashes with how we usually think about everyday objects, where collections need a certain unity to be considered one thing.
Right, like my junk drawer doesn't feel like a single object, even though I can refer to it as one linguistically.
Exactly. And the same goes for bare plural noun phrases like lions and mass nouns like gold, which function as kind terms. Language seems super flexible in forming these kinds. We can talk about the kind round square just as easily as the kind tree, even though round squares are logically impossible.
So, language lets us create categories that might not map onto anything real, but aren't there other ways to interpret those linguistic phenomena, like that idea of plural reference?
Oh, for sure. Not everyone agrees that definite plurals refer to single unrestricted sums. The theory of plural reference says that a phrase like the stones refers to each individual stone collectively, but not to one unified entity that's the sum of the stones. This is supported by certain linguistic behaviors. Similar debates exist about mass nouns and how they refer to quantities, and some linguists argue that bare plurals and kind terms don't actually refer to kind entities at all, but instead work more like quantifiers.
So, even within natural language ontology, there are different interpretations of how language works and what it tells us about ontology. What about intentional definite NPs? Those sound pretty technical.
They are a bit technical. These are phrases like the rising temperature or the author of the next great American novel. They look like normal definite noun phrases, seeming to pick out a specific thing. But the things they refer to are kind of weird because their identity might change over time or across different situations.
Like, the rising temperature refers to different degrees of heat at different times.
Exactly. Some analyses say these phrases refer to variable embodiments or variable objects. But there are other theories that don't need such ontologically flexible entities. For example, Bertrand Russell's theory of descriptions, or Montague's idea that the temperature refers to a function that maps times to temperature values.
So again, different interpretations of the language lead to different ontological conclusions. And finally, what about introduction by abstraction? What's that all about?
This is about the ways language seems to let us create abstract objects, like numbers and properties, from concepts or expressions that don't directly refer to anything. A classic example is Frege's theory of how we get numbers as objects by abstracting away from the concept of equinumerosity. And philosopher Stephen Schiffer has talked about pleonastic entities, which are seemingly introduced into our ontology through certain linguistic transformations. It's like we're getting something for nothing. But the question is, are these abstract entities and the linguistic processes that create them really part of the core ontology of language? Or do they belong to the more reflective, less ontologically committing periphery?
It sounds like language gives us the power to create abstract concepts and treat them like real things, but whether those creations correspond to something real is up for debate. Okay, let's move on to intentional or non-existent objects. This takes us back to unicorns and round squares, right?
It does. The idea that there are non-existent or intentional objects, which is the heart of Meinongianism, is often inspired by language. We can say things like, Pegasus does not exist, or John is thinking about a unicorn, and those phrases Pegasus and a unicorn look just like regular noun phrases.
It sounds like they're referring to something even if that something doesn't exist in.